I was talking to somebody about a month ago, and they suggested I share this. So I thought, okay, I thought about it for the last month, and I thought to share a little bit of my process with how I've learned about some things about working with the afflictions since I moved here. And I think for me, what happens is that I didn't really grow up with language describing emotions. It's not something we spoke about. So when I started learning about Buddhism, and when we, like, say, study the mental factors or whatever, these various afflictions, whether they're virtuous or non-virtuous, for me, they're like words on a page. They are words, and they don't actually mean anything to me, except for maybe, I know what the word is. It's supposed to refer to something. It's very much an intellectual thing of, this is a gong, this is a striker, this is anger, this is pride. It's just words. And I know a little bit more about gongs. But in terms of my other thing, I don't know how I came to this, but my whole orientation just naturally in my own practice, because I did start meditating without a teacher for many decades. So I'm kind of self-taught in that regard, unfortunately. But luckily I had some good something going on there, maybe previous karma, where I tended to always look at my experience. Like, the teachings to me was always a matter of, look at your experience. Where is this in your experience? And so, of course, when then I started learning about Buddhism formally with a teacher, and especially with Venerable Chodron, and also at the Sakya Monastery, it was, what are these things we're talking about here? And especially when I moved here and started really trying to learn about the antidotes. And I remember, although I moved here in 2005, in 2012, I think it was, Venerable taught a BBC from some verses from Nagarjuna, that's in the Chinese canon, where it talked about these antidotes, the afflictions. And I think that was 2012. I can remember, like, sitting in the meditation hall, knowing my mind was disturbed, reading down the list, trying to figure out which one is going on here. That was very helpful to me. I had this list of like 20 possibilities. Which one is happening for me? And that for the very beginning, from moving here for many years, for me, it was always a process of working backwards from the result. I would find something that worked, and then from that, I would figure out, what is it that I am actually experiencing? So it was always a backwards thing. In fact, a lot of my practice has always gone that way. It's gone from finding something that works and then working my way backwards to see, what is it I'm really doing here? I think that would somewhat describe how my process has been. I think that's partly because of this thing with much of my experience, inner experience, isn't so much related to words. I do have to have words to express things, but I do find there's like a disconnect sometimes in trying to articulate things between even what I'm thinking about. There's always this process of translation. There's like steps that happen for me. So then I think where I think this has been helpful in my process was, like, for instance, of course, we try to work with the largest affliction first, which is what I've always focused on, even every day. Like, when I'm trying to set my motivation in the morning, I need to get my mind calm. It's like, what's in the way of being calm? And I'll just kind of start with that. What's the biggest thing? Or even when I set motivations, a lot of times, like, or do purification, I will ask myself, what is the biggest thing that's stopping me from making progress? And I will try to purify that. And so there came a time where I was interested in looking into jealousy and pride. And my process around that actually helped me a lot. I would read anything and everything about them in books, and then try to look at my experience and find them and talk to people. And I don't know, reading helps me a lot because it gives me time to think about things and look at my experience and kind of go back and forth. And one thing I remember is that Patrul Rinpoche said that it's very difficult for us to see jealousy and pride. So I particularly thought, okay, I think that seems to be true. And so I made a point of talking to people about those. And I remember Zopa was living here then, and I asked her about pride. This is one of the first things I learned. It really has stuck with me, and it's helped me tremendously. Because pride, isn't so easy to work with at first. Many people that I know feel a large sense of shame when they see pride in the mind, and that gets in the way. And then after a while, it gets to the place where when you recognize something, instead of it making you want to crawl into a hole, you're more like, oh, I'm so glad I can see this, because it's like you're letting go of a burden. But it doesn't start that way. So I think that's good to know, that you can actually get to a place where you recognize something and it gets easier and easier to deal with, easier to experience, easier to accept and all that. But what happened with Zopa was the first time she met Venerable Chodron, she went in for one of these 10-minute interviews at, I think it was at Cloud Mountain. And she asked her, I guess she must have asked her about pride. And Venerable said to her, well, when you're with somebody, do you think there's anything you can learn from them? And I asked myself that question a lot. I think this has been a really good training for me, because I wanted to recognize pride, and I have learned many things about it from talking to people and reading and looking at my own experience. And I remember back then also, I was thinking like, well, what is it really like? When I was a teenager, we used to talk about, like when I was in like 8th grade, like, they're so conceited. We used that word. They're so conceited. And I was asking myself, well, what did that mean? What were we talking about back then? What were we seeing and experiencing? I just found all these places in my life where I actually used these words, and what did it refer to? What was the experience? What was my mind like? So this has kind of been my process. And one of the things that I think is the biggest thing that's helped me to maybe see the need for, there's a lot of really good reasons to recognize pride and diminish it. It just gets in the way. It disconnects you from people, is my experience, and I think others as well. It doesn't allow you to learn much because you already know everything, right? So why would you learn anything? You're not inquisitive. You're just like, there's a kind of a closeness to it. And you're putting people away in a way that in my heart of hearts, I don't want to. So it's not something I want to have. And then also, all of my life in looking at Eastern religion since I was young, and since these materials were available, which they weren't always, but Thich Nhat Hanh was always one of the earlier people that had books out in the 80s, right? In the 1980s, for sure, his books were out. And he talks a way about pride, and he talks it more about it in terms of respect, which I think these two are really quite related, important to understand. I think he's really got this right. Like, he always says that if you want to love someone, you have to respect them. And we have this value. We recite the 4 immeasurables, right? We want people to have happiness and the cause of happiness. But what is it that gets in the way? And this is where pride comes in, because pride is actually a lack of respect for another human or any kind of being. And so when you think about it that way, rather than thinking about how great it is to be puffed up, you're when the mind has pride on board, you're actually shielding yourself from being able to actually live and develop some of the things that we wish for most dearly, is to have kind of like loving kindness for other beings, any beings. And to see the connection there, I think, is quite important, and something that I think he has right. And so you can see these things, they interconnect with each other. So yeah, I think those are things I wanted to share. I remember there was some months ago where I was thinking, oh, maybe it's useful to speak about pride from this vantage point, and how, different ways that people enter into learning about afflictions and working with them. But for me, it's always been a matter of looking inside and trying to find this in my experience. And as I said, sometimes it's a matter of working backwards. And I've had to, like, sometimes I say, go in through the back door. For instance, like, a good example of that is working with jealousy. The usual antidote to that is like to rejoice in another's good fortune. And that really didn't work for me at all. And that's when these verses that we learned from Nagarjuna were so helpful, because they were set in a context of giving, meaning already your mind is virtuous because you're taking to light and doing something virtuous. So in that context, when you're giving, you want to be respectfully mindful of another. That was the antidote for pride, being respectfully mindful of another. And that right there was so beneficial to my mind when I was experiencing jealousy, was to see that when I just did that, I went from not making eye contact, not looking at another person, to actually looking at them and seeing, like, oh, wow, this is so good that they have this. You know, like, if I wasn't doing that, I was just like stuck in my affliction, like, rah, 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 I want this. And the ugly part about jealousy for me, the worst part of it is that whatever, say it's with another person, what is that thing that you want from them? You are actually now making the other person into like a commodity. And I find that kind of, that really, it's not what I want to be doing. And when I have jealousy come up, I remind myself of this. In this moment, you actually don't care much about that person that you're jealous of. You actually are wanting something out of them, like they're a commodity, right? That's how it feels inside to me. And so just that right there is just like, so like, kind of hard. Who wants to have that in your mind? So this is, to me, my own internal experience of what jealousy is involved with. It's not just like you want this thing and you can't rejoice in the other. You also are making people into, it's like when Hillary Clinton was running for president. You never really saw who Hillary Clinton was. All you saw was this like cardboard image that was projected in the press of a human being. And this is what we're doing when we have these kind of afflictions on board. We're like, we've now got this image of something that we want, and it's like, you might as well go into a business transaction because you want something. And this is not the way that we're aspiring to live. But I think this is what the afflictions do. So yeah, those are the things I wanted to share.